All right, let's jump right in. I want you to picture this. It's 1796. Europe is in chaos, revolutions are brewing, but we're focused on a quiet English doctor. He's about to perform an experiment that is so shocking, so seemingly awful, that it's either going to make him a monster for all time or give humanity one of its greatest gifts ever.
And yeah, this quote, it really cuts to the chase, doesn't it? This was no accident. In July of 1796, Dr. Edward Jenner took pus from a live smallpox blister and scratched it right into the arm of a perfectly healthy kid. By every bit of logic at the time, this should have been a death sentence.
So that's the big question we're tackling today. How on earth could a man take a risk like that? And why do we celebrate him now instead of, condemning him? To get that, we have to understand the world he was so desperately trying to save.
See, before Jenner, everyone lived under this constant, terrifying shadow of a single disease, smallpox. It was an absolute monster that shaped society, scarred anyone who survived it, and just terrified everybody, from the poorest person to the king on his throne.
Now, a 10% death rate, that might not sound huge today, but you have to remember, this was an age with almost no real understanding of hygiene. Smallpox spread like wildfire through these crowded, filthy cities. So if you caught it, you had about a 1 in 10 chance of dying. And believe me, for the people who survived, the nightmare was far from over.
The survivors were left with these deep, pitted scars all over their bodies called pockmarks. And the disfigurement was so awful that a lot of people were actually more afraid of the scars than they were of dying. Having a clear, unscarred face was a genuine rarity, a mark of real beauty. And this thing didn't care if you were rich or poor. It killed kings like Louis XV of France and left permanent scars on leaders like George Washington. This was the enemy.
So how do you even begin to fight an enemy like that? Well, the answer didn't come from some fancy laboratory in London. Nope, it came from country folk wisdom, basically a local superstition that an English country doctor named Edward Jenner happened to be curious enough to listen to.
Now, there was this other idea floating around at the time, brought over from Turkey by an aristocrat. It involved taking fluid from a mild case of actual smallpox and giving it to someone. It kind of works sometimes, but it was incredibly risky. You were still playing with the real disease. The English medical world mostly just wrote it off as some weird foreign thing. But Jenner, he'd heard this local story in his county of Gloucestershire. The milkmaids, the women who worked with cows, they'd get this mild disease called cowpox. And they just didn't seem to ever get smallpox.
And this is where Jenner has his big aha moment. He starts connecting the dots. Wait a minute. Are milkmaids thought to be so beautiful simply because their faces are clear? And are their faces clear because catching this totally harmless cowpox from the cows was somehow protecting them? He started to think, maybe this farmer's superstition is actually a huge medical clue.
Which brings us right back to that terrifying day in May of 1796. Jenner, armed with his pretty wild theory, decided it was time to put it to the ultimate test. He said himself that he was taking on a frightful responsibility. His experiment was methodical, and it was incredibly daring. First, he took fluid from a cowpox sore on a milkmaid's hand and scratched it into the arm of this 8-year-old boy. The boy got a little sick for a day or two, but then he recovered just fine. Then came the moment of truth. 2 months later, Jenner did the unthinkable. He deliberately exposed the boy to the deadly smallpox virus. He waited, and nothing happened. The boy didn't get sick at all. It worked. He was immune.
Jenner came up with a name for his new procedure, vaccination, which comes from the Latin word for cow, vacca. But here's what really shows you what a great scientist he was. He didn't rush out and tell everyone immediately. Nope, he waited 2 whole agonizing years to find another cowpox case so he could repeat the entire experiment just to prove his results weren't some crazy fluke. Only then, in 1798, did he publish his findings.
And the impact was, well, it was world-changing. Almost overnight. Jenner's discovery wasn't just a new treatment. It was a completely new way of thinking about disease. Even Napoleon Bonaparte, who was trying to conquer all of Europe, was in awe. There's a story that he released English prisoners just because Jenner's name was on the petition. He said he could refuse nothing to the man who conquered smallpox.
The idea spread like wildfire. The British royal family got vaccinated. The German state of Bavaria made it mandatory way back in 1807. But pretty ironically, England was one of the slowest places to really honor him. In fact, the London College of Physicians actually refused to make him a member because he hadn't studied ancient Greek and Latin classics. They cared more about old books than a discovery that was actively saving thousands of lives.
But you just couldn't argue with the results. Just look at this chart. In only 18 months, A year and a half after the Royal Generayan Society started its work, the number of people dying from smallpox in England dropped by a staggering 2/3. The proof was right there, in all the people who were not dying.
And right here, this is the absolute core of Jenner's legacy. He was the first person in history to figure out how to prevent a disease instead of just trying to treat it after you were already sick. This was a complete, total game changer. It was like unlocking a brand new superpower for medicine.
By doing this, he basically founded a whole new branch of science, immunology. He proved that you could introduce a mild, harmless version of a disease to the body to teach its own defense systems, what we now know as antibodies, how to recognize and fight off the real deadly threat.
And that one single idea, it's the foundation for nearly every single vaccine we have today. The Salk vaccine that fights polio, the shots that protect us from the flu, from typhoid, from dozens of other diseases, they all stand on the shoulders of Edward Jenner and that one monstrous experiment he did on an 8-year-old boy.
And that leaves us with a really fascinating thought to end on. Jenner's world-changing idea started because he took a farmer's superstition seriously. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What seemingly weird observations or bits of folk wisdom from today might actually hold the key to the next great scientific leap forward? What are we overlooking right now?